As Sarah mentioned, my name is Spencer Chase. I'm lucky enough to be the managing editor here at Agri-Pulse Communications and work with a great team and work with all of you to keep farmers and ranchers informed on the nation's policy updates here in Washington, D.C. And as Sarah mentioned, going to take a bit of a different look at the farm policy system here with this next presentation. I'm really excited for all of you to hear from our next speaker. Executive Director of Food and Consumer Trends at Rabobank, Nick Fereday. Prior to his current role, he served as Senior Economist and Vice President of Sales, Research, and Marketing at LMC International, which is an independent economic and business consultancy for the agribusiness sector. Please join me in welcoming Nick Fereday.
Good morning, everyone. Wow, real people, a real live event. I have to confess I haven't done this for a couple of years, so I'm going to just kind of hide behind this speaker's podium in case I get a little nervous. And I've even brought my cheat sheet with me in case I run out of things to say. My new friend Jason from New Zealand has heard of Rabobank, where he described us as bold and informative. So I hope that I can live up to that. But if you haven't heard, we are a Dutch bank, and all we do is food and agriculture. We lend to farmers all the way through to food companies and retail and everything in between. I'm in the research group. I'm not one of those equity analysts that's giving a buy and sell verdict on companies, but we're kind of trends, big picture type analysis. My area of focus is much more around the consumer, where the consumer's head is. And whereas a lot of my colleagues have been knee-deep in all the things that have been going on within the grains and oils and dairy sector and so on. I have a British accent because I'm British, but I have been living in the US for 20 years. My two kids have pitch-perfect Brooklyn accents, and I became an American citizen around 4 or 5 years ago. So before Spence and I have a bit of a discussion and hopefully answer some of your questions, really had like 5 headlines I wanted to bring to your attention. Other speakers have talked about them already, but also as you deliberate around the new Farm Bill, please take these into consideration. The first one really is this myriad of macro pressures. In some ways, a lot of things that we've been able to take for granted for so many years have really come to kind of knock us in the face. The supply chain constraints, all the layers of complexity that are adding to management decision-making processes that we've had through the COVID pandemic, and other catalytic events. I mean, you only have to walk around DC to still see the signage around Black Lives Matter, or the climatic events we've had, and now, of course, Ukraine. And so this kind of greater appreciation now around complexity, around uncertainty, and maybe our overconfidence that we had in our business models and our spreadsheets where we managed risk, we should probably question a little bit more. I would argue it's not that the world's become more uncertain. It's always been uncertain. It's just that we've become more aware of that again. And so the need for more scenarios in our planning, the idea that we can predict the future. I mean, the idea after all these catalytic events that suddenly our crystal balls are going to start working again this year, and we can see what's around the corner. And with all this talk of resilience that we're hearing, let's also remember the incredible resilience of the American consumer, who has shown incredible ingenuity through the pandemic. We've learned how to shop differently. We've learned how to cook differently. We've learned how to use social media to inspire us in our recipes. And we bought all these gadgets as well for our homes, right? Our coffee makers and whatever, to recreate those restaurant experiences. And of course, the big area that's front of mind for a lot of consumers, and again has been mentioned by other speakers, is the return of, after years, if not decades, of slumber. The previous speaker was a young lad when we last heard of inflation. It was 1982, the last time we saw 7.9% CPI. Was anyone working, remember, back then? Or, yes, a few hands. We can admit our age. We're not ageist here. Proud, old and wise. So very long time ago. In the food scene, in supermarkets, inflation is almost up at 8% this year, so far, year on year, which compares to something like 1.5%, 1.9%, sorry, 1.5% over the last 10-year average. And interestingly, when we listen or when we hear the large food companies, they say that demand is still holding up for their products right now. Consumers are still buying their products and taking the price hit, but for now. I mean, obviously, we all have to eat, but there's no complacency there. There are many options on how we choose to eat and where we choose to eat. And with all the supply and demand drivers that are affecting inflation, it's also important to remember where the consumers' heads are right now. We have to remember that in the US economy, consumer expenditure drives something like 70% of GDP in this country. So where the consumers' heads are at, where their level of positivity around the future is very important, because if it isn't up there, if it isn't rising, then you will get that sucking sound of demand being pulled out of the economy. And when you look at the surveys, it's not in a good place right now. And a lot of these surveys were done before the latest incursions around an invasion of Ukraine. Something like a 10, 11-year low in consumer confidence right now. They're concerned around the stock market, around the state of the economy, and around Ukraine. And these things won't change quickly. Food insecurity is another area as well, where inflation is a huge tax on the poor, disproportionately so. In this country, around 41 million people take SNAP benefits. That whole system has doubled in cost during the pandemic. There's 5 or 6 million more people are on SNAP since the start of the pandemic, but the actual cost of the whole SNAP program has doubled to $113 billion right now. And so the idea of nutrition security, as the Deputy Secretary mentioned, is becoming certainly front of mind to 41 million people within the United States. The third area really is about what I kind of call these kind of booster shots, these areas of which are helping certainly food companies experience elevated demand still during the pandemic. We've all had our regret purchases, right, during the pandemic. The regrets of buying that, all that gym equipment at home, or maybe that fancy Peloton. Back home in England, people were buying hot tubs. They must have forgotten just how bad the weather is in England if they thought that was going to be a good idea. But certainly within our world, there are two enduring habits that a lot of food companies are talking about that they feel will continue to elevate demand. The first one is around e-commerce, the digitalization of our food systems, where for the first time, food has really found its relevance online. Companies have learned to sell products online, either in direct-to-consumer markets or on third-party platforms like Amazon or your supermarkets. And companies have really pivoted and risen to the challenge of that. We have large companies like a General Mills that pre-pandemic was selling just a couple of percentage points of their products online, and it's now up to 10% of their products. And the latest craze in this whole world is these 10 to 15 minute fast grocery delivery companies that will get things to your door ASAP. These are trying to replace our convenience stores with dark stores and home rapid delivery. I mean, back in the pandemic, at the start of the pandemic, we were shopping and pantry hoarding as if we would never run out of anything. And now we're getting to the point where we can't live 10 to 15 minutes without having to jump onto our apps. The second area, which I think is important, is the idea of how the center of focus of where we spend our food dollar has come back towards the home, this home centricity. In food company speak, there's a lot more eating occasions happening at home. Certainly a lot of white-collar workers, around 55% of the workforce in this country, expect to have more flexible working from home conditions and expect to have that 1 or 2 a day at home, which has a profound impact on the food service industry. Even if you're just working at home 1 day a week, that's a 20% cut in volumes. You're not going out for those coffees because you've bought that fancy coffee maker. You're not having those snacks on the go. At Cliff Bar, there's a gentleman who was formerly from Cliff Bar here in the audience today, because we are no longer on the go in the same way, and business travel is still way down. And so these events are challenging, but they also create incredible opportunities, and a lot of companies are rising to the occasion and trying to cater for those at-home eating occasions. We're all Netflix snacking now, which is a new opportunity, where companies are coming out with pantry packs to try and address that. So the fourth area, which always generates a lot of media attention, is around plant-based food. You know, it certainly dominated the media headlines, and this move towards flexitarianism. It was going to take over the world. They're growing incredibly strong. All we could hear about in the newspapers was what was going on with the veggie burgers. A lot of that has ground to, or certainly slowed down, if not reversed. And quite surprisingly to a lot of people who are expecting, you know, world domination of plant-based foods in a very short space of time. And it's left a lot of people scratching their heads as to why that happened, why that is the case. Why hasn't that, you know, incredibly strong growth rate continued? Why has it suddenly paused so very, very quickly? And no one seems to know the answer exactly, and lots of different reasons. The first one being the obvious one around novelty, and people tried it, and then they moved on. The consumer. Consumer in a lot of ways it can be very fickle around things, and just because we read a lot about it in the newspapers doesn't mean that it's really penetrated within mainstream America in the way that everyone just assumed that it had. The ingredients list of these products has also come under scrutiny. You know, having cleaner labels and minimally processed foods was always a trend before the pandemic, and somehow plant-based foods were immune to this. They could get away with having a Twinkie-like ingredients list because they had, you know, higher claims around sustainability, which for a lot of consumers outweighed that list. But I think it's coming home to roost now, where these highly processed plant-based foods are being really judged in the same way that a lot of other packaged foods are, for sure. And then, of course, the other thing is the no-brainer, really, price and taste. A lot of this stuff does not taste like meat. Can I say that? Is that even, you know? Certainly to this audience, I'm sure that goes down well. If I was at the Natural Products Expo, I would have been chased out by now. Some of them taste fantastic, some of them less so, but there are literally 1,200 store brands out there now. And some of them are not that good. All right, I've made some friends here this morning. I should probably stop speaking at that point. My last point before Spence and I sit down is really just to highlight the dangers of when we focus too much on one ingredient and we end up demonizing an ingredient to the detriment of that ingredient and to the wider story. And the obvious example is really the story around sugar in this country, or sugars. In this country, our consumption of caloric sweeteners that contain calories like sugar and HFCS, has actually declined by 20% over the last 2 decades. We are consuming 1/5 less sugars than we did. And none of us have, and our collective waistlines have not been reduced at all. This is not what we were promised, right? You know, we have been drilled in from our dentists not to eat sugar for very good reasons around dental caries. But from dietary guidelines to every food influencer out there, we've been told not to have sugar because of the links or the causal relationships with obesity and so on. And yet we've cut our HFCS consumption by 42% because we are drinking a ton less sodas. We've cut our overall sugar sweetener by 20%, like I said, slightly more on sugar. But guess what? We haven't made any impact. And this is, it's almost ridiculous to kind of make such causal relationships, but this is the story we were sold, that if we cut one ingredient, then we would solve our obesity problem. And we kind of demonized sugar. We certainly demonized HFCS. If you looked on Twitter back in the day when people were really laying into it, it was referred to as the devil's candy of all things. And so we're kind of at this point now where, as consumers, it's like, well, we've cut sugar and it's made no difference. So what do we do now? Do we keep digging? Do we keep cutting our sugar because it's still above recommended guidelines? Do we look for alternative sweeteners? There's always a new one around the block, right? There's always a new sweetener, a new holy grail that's going to promise that tastes like sugar but doesn't deliver on calories. We know that zero sugar or sugar reduction, low-calorie products are a big winner in the supermarket, and that's not going to change any soon. Or do we really step back and pause and think, well, until we have really strong data on this, right, that really points the finger at something, maybe we should start thinking about other things that we eat. Maybe it's the calorie story or whatever. And really think about, if we demonize one thing and we're telling consumers the wrong thing, what does that say about us, and what does it say about the long-term health for consumers? Do we have people from the Sugar Association here or something? Because I've suddenly become best mates with those guys as well. All right, I will leave it at that, and I will join Spence if that's.
That is great. Looking forward to the conversation. Would love to have you join me over here, Nick, because I think you've kind of set up something that everyone is trying to figure out at this point. Food and agriculture, transportation, energy, whatever the industry, everyone is trying to figure out what in the heck the pandemic afterlife, should we ever reach one, is going to look like. And, you mentioned some of those changes in shopping trends, changes in consumption trends, more cooking at home taking place during the pandemic. Do we have any data points, any knowledge at this point about what the durability of some of those changes will be, and how long consumers will, continue to eat at home, and what that might mean for what they're going to purchase as a result?
Well, obviously, great question. I think a lot of people now have realized, and it came to me last year, and I'm getting straight into the anecdotal, is that the pandemic is not a single event that we get over. It's something that we learn to live with. And I think once you realize that, then your perspective changes as well. There's certainly, so no one knows, right? I made the point around our crystal balls no longer working. And I used to do presentations before the pandemic based around a survey where I would ask my readership, what was the biggest surprise of the last year? And I stopped doing it because it became inappropriate, because we were having the biggest surprise, like it almost seemed like on a monthly basis, of things that we weren't expecting. So when we look out into the future, we can only think of scenarios, right? And we talk to different groups and sectors within the food and ag space and hear what they have to say. Certainly food companies present a lot of arguments for these at-home eating occasions, this greater flexibility of the workforce, and they see that as huge opportunities and to cater for that. Food companies also get very excited around the growing or the renewed interest in, and it's an old subject, around food as medicine and what products they can supply to consumers to help them in a way self-medicate, because people have become much more interested or renewed their interest in health and wellness. And how we would choose to define health and wellness has in fact changed. Back in the 80s, when inflation was the last problem, it was all around low-fat diets and lean cuisine and things like that. And now it's a much more holistic approach, which has a lot of mental health as part of the story, which actually excuses us for indulging in food as well, because it may not be good for our waistlines, but it certainly makes us feel a lot better.
So as we look then at those consumption trends you were discussing, what about the purchasing changes? You mentioned some of the direct to consumer modeling that some of these larger food companies were doing, but I mean, I would have to assume that there's been a bit of an explosion in grocery delivery as opposed to actually visiting the grocery store. What do we know about the staying power of that trend?
Yeah, again, it's our impression that food has found a relevance online. I mean, obviously during the pandemic and those lockdowns, we were all scrambling, and everyone was facing a certain level of food insecurity that they'd never faced before, right? Suddenly, even the most affluent consumer was having difficulty or couldn't follow the normal routes to get their food supply, because restaurants and whatever had closed down. But I think the explosion or the alternatives of new routes to the consumer present incredible opportunities for various different groups of the food system. We obviously, food companies are setting up direct-to-consumer, which they're really enjoying, because it helps them co-create, it helps them develop products with their customers, and they get to learn directly from about their customers. I was talking to one company, and they were saying, what amazed them about when they started selling direct-to-consumer is they learned about the demographics of their consumer base. They thought that they were some cool, trendy millennial brand, and it turns out that the actual main consumer was the boomer generation. and so they change their marketing and product mix accordingly. Companies have invested very heavily in this kind of digital supply chain, and they think it's here to stay because they're getting the relationship with the customer, and they're also getting a new route to the customer which complements everything else that they do. I mean, consumers generally pick and choose on a daily basis where they want to shop. They have different places to go to for different need states. And so the fact that they can become even more omnipresent is a bonus.
Well, and I want to stick with some of the food company stuff that you've mentioned here before we get back into Farm Bill stuff, because I think the company points that you raise are fairly interesting. And I have to assume that the pandemic brought about some changes that maybe some companies kind of liked and they're planning on sticking with going forward.
Yes, well, I think the pandemic's changed all of us, right? And so I think one of the things that food companies they've realized is that they can be more agile, right? They can make faster decision-making processes than they thought they had. And I think they don't want to give that up now. So the idea of taking 3 months to develop, 3 years to develop a product, they can, well, let's see if we can do that faster and anticipate and respond to consumers' needs a lot faster. And similarly on the supply chain, it's all the R words, right, around resilience and building in redundancy. But I think for a lot of people, and I'm sure a lot of you guys experience this also, you're still too busy putting out fires to actually kind of sit back and have that strategic overview of, okay, we really do need to bring our supply chain home, but we haven't really got the bandwidth right now to think about how that might work and what that is. Because in some ways, or to what extent have we all been operating our supply chains in an uninsured way, right, without this redundancy and the idea of going, it's almost a cliche now because everyone's talking about it so much, from just in time to just in case, right, a supply chain. And for a lot of people, they still don't have the time to have implemented such a change because they are still putting out fires.
Yeah, and I suppose big changes that would have been needed to make some of these companies pivot as well. I want to look at sort of the consumer side of things, particularly through the lens of agricultural legislation on Capitol Hill and what that might mean. But before we dive too deep into that, what do we know about what the consumer is telling American agriculture and agriculture worldwide at this point about the kinds of food it wants produced and how it would like it to be produced?
Yeah, so almost impossible question to answer, right? Because there are 330 million Americans, all individual consumers, and the idea that we have products that satisfy everyone's needs is kind of less and less so. We're becoming increasingly tribal, and companies and restaurants look to certain segments that they wish to satisfy rather than and regions rather than try and satisfy everyone. The one-size-fits-all model of a lot of large food companies may no longer be as relevant as it once was, although, of course, we all still want to eat burgers, and that's not going to change. It's a tricky one, right, because I think it all depends on different groups. So in some ways, I don't know the answer to that question because there are 330 million voices all clamoring. I think consumers have very basic, they want their basic needs to be met, right? And we talked about this before. To the extent that there is a coordinated food strategy, what I think would be of huge interest and benefit to everyone in the space. I know that we have lots of different policies as the Deputy Secretary outlined, but the idea, and maybe this is a Slido question and someone can answer for me, so it's like we haven't had a national food policy since the war, right, since the 1940s, if that's correct, where we know that the impact of, say, the Farm Bill, what the impact that is on other parts of the food chain or other bits of legislation that the FDA or the USDA are running with and trying to see the bigger picture in some of this to make sure that we are all trying to meet the collective goals.
That national food policy that you mentioned, if I give you the magic pen and let you write it, maybe you don't want to give away all of the particulars, but what boxes do you think it at least would need to check?
Well, I think there's certainly in the last couple of years we've become a lot more aware of there are more stakeholders out there than we first thought, right? I mean, a lot of food companies have talked about, their mission is to satisfy all their stakeholders and not just their shareholders. Sometimes that gets them in trouble when they don't deliver on their quarterly results. But the idea of who are all the stakeholders for a national food strategy? It's the consumers, it's the producers, the farmers, it's the people who work in restaurants, it's the food, it's the whole the cold chain and so on, and then that becomes millions of people, and in a way it's everyone because we're all ultimately consumers. Good luck writing that, by the way.
Yeah, and we've got a few folks in the room that might be tasked with such a thing if ever a decision was made. You made some points also about the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, some of the broader nutrition assistance that was provided, throughout the pandemic. What did the pandemic teach us about the resiliency, perhaps lack thereof, of that programmatic structure that we see, behind some of those policies, and how it was able to adapt to something like a COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I don't really know the ins and outs of the program, but I think we've all, in all our own industries, and I'm sure you can think of your own industries when I say this, is that we've all been pleasantly surprised by how responsive and agile we can be when we have to be, right? And so that even the stereotypical government being unwieldy and too large can move quite quickly when it has to. And so the fact that grants can be raised, benefits can be raised when people are in dire situations is satisfying, is gratifying. Sorry.
So, and you mentioned a Slido question. We do have a couple coming in here. Would encourage all of you, if you think of something that you'd like to have Nick address, by all means, would encourage you to submit those questions. I want to talk about one, wondering the question of food labeling, and they're asking, should food labeling be something that's authored in the context of the Farm Bill? But I also want to ask you, as part of that, what do we know about the consumers and how much trust or how much weight they actually put in food labeling as part of their consumer decision making?
It's always a question I ask people. Slido, who here reads food labels, right? I mean, on one level we like to think that we do, right? And but then we have to remember there are 40,000 product SKUs in the average supermarket. So if you went shopping and started reading all the labels, it would take you all your time. So you have to do shortcuts. You have to trust the institutions, the places where you go and shop, that they have the products that you choose. A Whole Foods, for example, has a no hidden nasties list of products, of ingredients that it bans. And then, of course, if you have a nutrition label, then it has to have information that's relevant and easily understandable. And I would say that the present system, on a personal level, I always get very confusing. I mean, probably starting with the point that it talks about 2,000 calories a day. If most people would die on 2,000 calories a day, it's not a sustainable amount of energy. So I think whatever's in the panel has to be clear and on message. Otherwise, it's going to just cause more confusion. We certainly, the faddishness of food, we have to be very wary of, and people like to have their stickers saying it's gluten-free or whatever. And a lot of these things are incorrectly mistaken or conflated with being healthy or better for you. Certainly if you're a celiac or you have allergies, then it is highly relevant. But so a lot of these things can be very misleading, and so the science has to be there to make sure that the consumer is not misinformed.
Does the consumer understand the current labeling regime, or are there questions there that need to be answered?
From my understanding is no, because everyone I know struggles to. I mean, guys, the next time you're at the supermarket, pick up a label and see if you can understand everything that it's telling you. It is confusing. Other countries are developing like Nutri-Scores or traffic light systems on front of label, front of pack, to kind of give you some much easier advice on where it is in terms of its salt level, its calorie level, and of course its sugar level. But I think more work can be done on that for sure.
You had mentioned in your remarks from the podium some thoughts around the plant-based food and whether or not that's a perhaps more of a long-term play. What does that community need to do? Given the if the halo effect is worn off, what do plant-based food manufacturers need to do to continue if they look to continue to build market share?
Yeah, I don't think anyone's. I think everyone views there is potential, long-term potential for this market. I mean, it's almost a rounding error. It's just still so small, but it's certainly not a rounding error in the media. It gets a lot of attention. It's 1 to 2% of the overall protein market. And even if it was growing double-digit, it would still take an incredibly long time to get even up to 5 or 10%. So I think rather than recognizing that the prize is probably further out there, recognizing that the whole, and it's a very exciting movement because it is introducing a lot of mainstream consumers to a whole host of new foods and products in the same way that the gluten-free diet introduced a lot of people to alternative grains and quinoas and whatever, and this all seems very normal now. There are some very indirect and positive benefits of trends that on the surface don't always make sense for most people. But I think it's kind of, the industry needs to understand what's going wrong right now. Why has demand slowed? What can we fix, rather than trying to focus on yet more products and more proliferation of products and fix what's going on? Is it the ingredients list? Is it the taste? Is it the price? Is it all of the above? Or is the addressable market not that big after all? And I think all those things should be figured out or have a stronger view on, rather than just this wishful thinking that people will end up accepting it or mandating it.
A couple of questions have been submitted on the subject of sustainability, and one I think is something that bears a little bit of discussion. Wondering, we hear a lot about this. The consumer wants a more sustainable food product. The consumer wants more sustainability in what they're eating. Is there research to back that up, that there is a plurality of consumers looking for this, or is this an example of perhaps a vocal minority?
I would say it is there. I think one of the surprises, certainly for me, of the last, certainly the pandemic years, was how sustainability remained front of mind for a lot of food companies. And it was front of mind for the food companies because it was front of mind for their consumers. And these are mainstream food companies, who had felt in previous years that they were maybe out of touch with the consumer and had lost the trust of the consumer. And they thought that by bolstering their sustainability credentials, by making announcements around single-use plastics, phasing that out, being net zero on carbon by 2050 or whatever, would help restore trust in their brands. And so I think it is very real. Whether that's, as of today, still as relevant given other priorities and given all the terrible things going on in the world, it may have to take more of a back burner to more immediate issues. And as people pivot, but it has certainly remained, either despite or because of the pandemic, important.
So generally speaking, the consumer is looking for it. Are they willing to pay for it and pay a premium for it?
Yes, well, this is always the million-dollar question, right? Should this be a, to what extent should a sustainable food product, and I don't even know what that means, but I'll say it, come with a price premium to cover the costs of certification or whatever, or should it just be factored in as a legitimate cost where the food company bears the brunt? And I think what we see is that these products often start out as, in Whole Foods, right, as a premium product, and gradually through economies of scale become more, the value equation improves, or the price points come down and becomes more accessible to a wider bunch of people. But no one willingly says, I will pay more. You wouldn't declare your hand like that normally, I think.
Although it sure would be convenient for some of the folks in this room if the consumer would be a little bit more communicative like that. I'm sure. Sure. But another question submitted from the audience relates to the antitrust environment. We've heard numerous folks from the Biden administration. We actually heard President Biden himself in his State of the Union address refer to the consolidation within the meatpacking sector, the 4 companies that own such a large percentage of the processing capacity there. A member of the audience wondering that current antitrust environment and the talking points around it, is that having any impact on consumer decision-making and consumer thoughts about things like meat, things like other areas of the food system that might be in similar levels of consolidation?
Yeah, so I can't really comment on the trust issue, and I have colleagues who work on animal protein who would also probably tell you that they wouldn't want to comment on that issue as well. I think what's important to remember is the point I made around how a lot of consumers drive the GDP in this country, right? 70% is coming from consumer expenditure, and we all get to choose how we spend our money. And so for whatever is important to a particular consumer, whatever their priorities are, then they can spend their money accordingly. There are now online websites, supermarkets like Thrive, where you can literally check the boxes for your diet, right? You could be vegan, you could be a paleo bro, you're into meat, or you're keto and very low carb, and you can check it. And it wouldn't be too much of a given how digitalized everything's becoming, to where you kind of have your political views as well, right? I mean, I grew up in England in the 80s, and there were huge trade sanctions on South Africa because of apartheid, right? And people would boycott South African goods because, as a way of showing their displeasure with the regime there. There's nothing stopping us all as individuals to express our political views and our personal views and our ethical views through how we choose to shop. And I would imagine there'll be a lot more of that for going. I mean, you could leave it to the retailer to make that decision for you, right? Or you could leave it to the food company, and we're seeing a lot of food companies under pressure. They've generally, as an industry, kind of delayed their response compared to other industries over Russia, or you can do it as an individual.
So that voting with your wallet kind of concept.
Yeah. Extremely powerful. I mean, it is extremely, and I think we forget that. I think often consumers, there could almost be a wake-up call for consumers when they just realize just how powerful that is. And how when companies start seeing how consumers respond to events, they will respond accordingly as well. I think it could be very...
Well, and this is a bit of a tangent on my part, but I mean, any concern from an analyst perspective of when that voting with your wallet might perhaps veer a little too far? I mean, the example that comes to mind for me is folks maybe abandoning vodka given the current events in the world, even though not all of it is produced in Russia.
Yes, yeah. Well, again, that becomes a story around information and how consumers get their information and how important. I mean, food has become more politicized and more important to people, and so it's almost a natural response. And also, it's the only way a lot of individuals can actually show their pleasure or displeasure, right? And obviously, things can be taken to an extreme, but we can't control that.
So when we talk about food becoming politicized, in this room we have some staffers who will be writing the next farm bill. We have some lobbyists who will be going to Capitol Hill advocating for their positions in it. As food becomes more and more politicized, your counsel to that group of people getting ready to write a farm bill in the context of a politicized food system in a changing pandemic, your thoughts on how they should use that information
Sure.
to their
I feel
benefit.
the world's just this hole is digging. And I can just fall into this. No, I would say the line about, and maybe I don't know if it did become a Slido question, but if we haven't had a national food policy since the war, why not? And is this now a good time to have a more coordinated approach? Are all stakeholders represented in all the legislation you're planning? And I think even those small boxes, if those 2 or 3 boxes were checked, I think most people would be very happy.
Let's go to maybe more familiar territory for you. Talking about the online shift in grocery sales, wondering what did we see in terms of that? Was there similar growth experienced internationally as there was in the U.S., and what did the trends look like in other countries?
Yeah, it was. I mean, shopping online had taken off, right? Companies like Amazon had really kicked the door open. What hadn't taken off was food shopping online. There was a belief that we had to go and squeeze the tomatoes, however you say them here, and so on. And of course, that turned out to be less true. And so once people realized, as you all have, the convenience of shopping online and of having those, different ways of click and collect, which is much more popular here, whereas it's home delivery in the UK, has really taken off. And it all becomes around the S-curve. At what point does this all level off? But it also created, growth within different categories. So frozen food became a huge hit with online shopping, which people weren't anticipating. And buying those big packs of snacks and packs of Cliff Bars and sodas or whatever, and buying in bulk. And all those things are pretty universal. And yeah, quite interesting, and here to stay, because it has become like a 2022 version of what is convenient now. It was not considered convenient. We're getting to the point where people complain about how many cardboard boxes they have to break down now for recycling. It's become that mainstream.
Well, and you mentioned the desire that some folks had to actually go and inspect the produce and the meat. I'm one of those people. Yeah, sure. I'm not a huge grocery delivery, and part of that is just the nature of this job. I'm a bit of a nerd. I want to see what the grocery store shelves look like, and I'm sure you remember as well the early days of the pandemic. Meat, milk, eggs, and toilet paper. I mean, were scarce if you could get them. Was that a short-term trend? Is there something we should learn from that long-term, or was that just a heat of the moment thing that we really shouldn't read too much into?
No, I think the whole omnichannel shopping experience is certainly here to stay. There's always going to be someone out there that will say, online marks the death of the supermarket, in the same way that people with their meal replacement drinks say that, we don't need to have kitchens in our homes because we can just, drink these products. So I think it's also important to remember that because this is such a large country, it can still be a niche market, right? A niche market, and still be billions of dollars in value. And the fact that a retailer, a supermarket, or a restaurant can satisfy their customers in new ways and creates a more encompassing experience only helps create a greater bond. If you can get your McDonald's or your hamburgers or whatever in lots of different ways, if your supermarket can come to your door, you can click and collect, or you can go to the supermarket and have that kind of Starbucks-like experiential, third space experience, then all for the good. And all of that works for all of us when we're in different need states, right? When we're in a rush, we want our 15-minute delivery. When we have more leisure and we want to go like you do and explore and see what's new and what's exciting in food, because we always like the novelty factor, then we want to go hang out at Sprouts or Whole Foods or wherever.
We're getting into the home stretch of our conversation here, but I do want to bring up something that's been asked about in a couple of different varieties here, and that is this concept of, we talked about sustainability, but the Department of Agriculture currently, pursuing language of what they call climate-smart commodities. And I guess my question is, we talked about the sustainability factor of this, but is there an appetite within, they say that this is about creating new markets for producers. Is there an appetite within consumers and within food companies, rather, to pursue this, at a federal government level, to also, bring this into the food supply chain and bring this into the nation's grocery stores?
Yeah, I think it's always interesting as to what is coming up, right? What is emerging from what people want to what is top down. And also what is, and this kind of proliferation of ideas where someone has we should have climate-friendly products, and it's a good idea, but then it becomes everyone's good idea, and then you end up with 1,500 different climate-smart labels. And we have that already, right? There are so many labels out there, and so it can become very confusing. So the idea of in some level, everyone doing their own thing and having their own goals, because then it becomes not only a license to operate, but also like a competitive advantage. If company X wants to be net zero by 2050, well, we're going to do it by 2040, so you should use our products. And then the role of government on that. The USDA's organic label, everyone looks at that as a gold standard. Like, this is when you can have something that is, easily recognizable, easily identifiable, it does not cause confusion or causes less confusion than having 100 organic labels, then that is very helpful for the consumer. So if we can come up as an industry with those type of solutions around climate, I think would be very interesting. But then it's a case of, well, should we just focus on grain or corn, or are we actually focusing on the end product? Because that's a lot harder to do. Yeah.
Nick, I could probably sit here and chat with you for another hour, but we are up against time, and I want to keep the program moving. For now, folks, please join me in thanking Nick.
Thank you very much.
Folks, we are going to recognize another sponsor here, our gold sponsor, John Deere. When we return to this stage, you will hear from my colleague, Jeff Nally. But for now, please join us in welcoming John Deere to the program.
Hi, I'm Chad Passman from John Deere. As a sponsor of this year's Ag and Food Policy Summit, I want to thank you for attending today's event as we explore the policies and politics involved with crafting a new farm bill that could have a huge impact on the livelihoods of American farmers and ranchers. There's no doubt sustainable agriculture will be one of the desired outcomes of any new farm bill. At John Deere, we think sustainability of modern agriculture is attainable through technology and innovation. As you know, for generations, farmers have cared for their land in ways that preserve it. They strive to make the most of every seed and kernel, every drop of nutrient and fuel, and every hour of work to ensure their business remains productive and profitable. Our vision is to ensure our customers are the most profitable and sustainable in the world. John Deere precision technologies help deliver the ultimate in sustainable outcomes. Farming operations that are more profitable and less intensive on the soil, water, and air. If you want to catch a glimpse of today's modern farm equipment and precision ag technologies that are going to help usher in a new age of sustainable agriculture, then I invite you to join us for tomorrow's in-person public celebration of National Ag Day that takes place on the National Mall right here in Washington, D.C. John Deere is joining forces with other ag equipment manufacturers and companies in bringing some of today's most innovative farm equipment and precision ag technologies to the National Mall. If you have questions about sustainable agriculture, I invite you to stop by our display and visit with our experts and leaders who can answer your questions and talk to you about the machines and technologies farmers are using to make it all possible. Finally, I want to thank Agri-Pulse for putting together today's great program, and thank you for your participation in the Ag and Food Policy Summit.